Today on Beavertown Outdoors, science. Hello again, friends. Welcome to another edition of Beavertown Outdoors. I'm John, and I'm out here at the beautiful Beavertown compound, out at the outdoor boiler, our Port Germain 2840. And this is going to be a unique video, different one than I've done before. I was recently contacted by our friends at Port Germain. Had a nice long conversation with them about my channel. They said they've seen a couple of my videos, they liked them, and had some suggestions for some content that I could do. And so that's one of those I'm going to bring you today. So some of you may be considering an outdoor boiler, or you have one and you're curious about how it works, some of the science behind it, and I'm going to explain that to you a little bit as simply as I can today. So you can see the Port Germain, she just fired up there, and she's getting ready to go through a burn cycle. So when it comes to an outdoor boiler, there's other videos out there that can tell you the basics behind it as far as how it gets heat to your house, right? An outdoor boiler or outdoor wood furnace or water furnace is basically a firebox that's surrounded by a water tank, and has a fire going inside. It heats up that water, gets it to a certain temperature, and then you have a pump and you have lines, and that takes it into your house, and you can use it. You can heat through either radiant heat, through baseboard heat, or radiant in-floor heat, or like we have, you can use the heat through your exchanger in your furnace. Looks kind of like a radiator, which just uses the fan on your furnace, not the actual burner, to push hot air through the house. So I'm not going to go into that so much. That's pretty easy to figure out or to find other videos on. But what I want to talk about is how does it manage the fire? So why is it that when you put wood in, it just doesn't burn all the way up? How does it keep from over temperature in the boiler, just boiling over, right? If you keep a pot on the stove long enough, with a fire, it's just going to boil over. It's just going to keep constantly absorbing heat until it turns to vapor. So I'm going to explain to you a little bit how that works, and to do that, I got to explain to you a little bit how fire works. Now, some of you may know my full-time or real job is I'm a firefighter. I've been a firefighter for 30 years or so now. So besides that, I'm also a certified fire investigator, and so I have a little bit of understanding of how fire works. And I'm going to give you a little bit of the basics here. So how a fire works is what is a fire? Fire is a chemical chain reaction. Here's where it's going to start sound nerdy. Fire is a chemical chain reaction that produces heat and light, and it occurs when a fuel meets a heat source in the presence of oxygen. So that chemical chain reaction is illustrated by what's called the fire triangle. And hopefully you can see my nice little drawing here. So we got a fuel. So for our fire, to make a fire anywhere, whether it's in a fireplace or in your outdoor boiler, you have fuel, which down here, which for us is our firewood. And then you have oxygen that comes from the air we breathe. So there's our air isn't pure oxygen, but there's enough oxygen in the air to sustain a fire. And to get that chain reaction going, just like any other chemical reaction, most other chemical chain reactions, you have heat. So put those three together, you have you create a chemical chain reaction, and this is known as the fire triangle. So how do you control a fire? Well, to control a fire, you simply remove any one of these three things, and this chain reaction, the fire can't happen. So how do you control a fire? Well, as far as removing the fuel, what would that entail? Well, the example of that is your stove or your wood furnace. Your fire goes out because there's no more wood. It burned up all the wood. So if the fire goes and it burns up all the fuel, there's no more fuel. You've removed that. Chemical chain reaction doesn't occur. Another way you can do that is to remove the heat. So that's how firefighters put out fires in general, is they are removing the heat. That's why they use water. So they use the water absorbs a certain amount of heat, takes that away from the fire. Once there's not enough enough heat to sustain that fire goes out. Now there are some ways that they put out with removing the oxygen, but in general that's how water puts out a fire. So that goes to why dry wood is important, because when you put your fuel in, if you put in wet green wood, it contains water. Water doesn't burn, water absorbs heat. So you're using up the heat that you're producing from your fire to boil off the water. So the other way of controlling a fire is through its oxygen. So that's how an outdoor boiler controls its fire. It controls the oxygen, whether it limits the fire's ability to breathe. Okay, so not to harken back to a 90s movie that was very popular. Fire is a living thing. It eats, it consumes the fuel, but it also has to breathe. To control a fire, you can do two different things. You can either limit its ability to vent out all its spent gases. Just like human beings do, we breathe in air, we expel carbon dioxide. But if you're sealed in an airtight room, eventually that environment is going to build up nothing but carbon dioxide that you expel, and we can't sustain on that. Eventually it displaces all the oxygen, or we use up all the oxygen, and you can no longer breathe. So similar thing for a wood stove or a boiler. If you take away, say you plug that chimney off, it's not going to have anywhere for the spent gases to escape, like they're doing right now behind me. So that's how, if you have a fire in your fireplace or you're in your outdoor boiler and it's not burning very well, you've got plenty of air going to it, but it doesn't want to burn. That gives you a clue. Check your chimney. Your chimney may be plugged off. Somehow that fire is not able to release all those gases, and they'll actually build up in a wood stove or in a boiler and back up through the vent system, through the intake. So which will eventually plug up that intake in certain cases, kind of like our central boiler did. That would eventually, the creosote and everything would back up during the normal smoldering process, and it would actually form creosote, plug up the intake, and then you couldn't get the fire to burn. So that brings us to primarily how this controls its fire. It controls it through limiting the intake. through limiting the air that comes in. So when this calls for heat, or excuse me, when this is at its full temperature, the blower, in this case, shuts off. Now, in a natural draft type furnace or fireplace or anything, that's gonna, there's just a damper that closes and it stops the air supply. In this case, this has a blower, which has finished its cycle, so it just shut off. Now, there's still some smoke and heat coming out, but no longer is the blower on, feeding air to the fire. So you just get the little bit, and eventually that smoke is going to stop coming out because it's going to use up what last oxygen is in the firebox. So right now there's still some oxygen in the firebox, from that wasn't completely consumed, but eventually that will be, and that fire is going to die down. Now the fire won't go completely out because the boiler is not perfectly airtight. There's still a little bit of air that's left in that can seep in, but generally it's going to just barely be enough to keep the fire going. And actually, if you leave it from venting long enough, eventually the fire is going to die out, because as the fire dampens from the lack of oxygen, it's going to cool off. Again, if you remove heat, if the fire loses its heat, it stops the fire. So there's a little bit that gets in there, but it will cool down, and that's going to actually cause the water to start cooling down, which will trip the sensor inside. Besides the draw, there's just the dampening of the fire. It'll trip the sensor, telling it, hey, we need more heat, turn the blower back on, or again, it's with some others, just open the damper, let the fire start again. So to illustrate how different that is, on the portage and main, down at the bottom is where the air comes in. And there's the little ash pan down here. But when you open that hatch, you actually open the intake back up. So I'm going to demonstrate here. I'm going to actually open the door. And what I want you to do is, as I open the door, watch the chimney. This will illustrate very well because it's just finished a burn cycle. And you'll see that fire will liven right back up. So I've opened the air intake. You see the smoke start to roll, and eventually this will actually whoosh. You'll hear a massive influx of air as the fire really picks up. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to close that back up. So opening that door, we allowed the air to come back in. That made the fire liven back up. Now you see, I've shut the door again, and that smoke dies down. So we've controlled the air that way. Same way a damper would do, an intake damper does on natural draft boiler. So this is actually the phenomenon too, which leads you to need to be careful when you open your outdoor boiler. And I'm going to show you something here. So I'm hoping I can have this close enough that you can see this happen without burning my camera or me. But so the boiler just finished its burn cycle. So we've got the fire dampened down. Fire always does one thing very well. When it starts off, it's looking for oxygen. It will go to and try to find oxygen. So as this is dampening down, you've now got a lot of spent gases that aren't completely burned, which are a good fuel, but no oxygen. When you open the door in this case, when the fire's like that, if you open this door wide open, you're going to reintroduce oxygen to the fire, and you're going to do it in a very rapid rate. This causes the phenomenon, which again is the title of the movie I mentioned earlier, called a backdraft. So you have a lack of oxygen, you have a lot of available fuel, and a lot of available heat. If you give that a sudden rush of oxygen, not in a controlled manner, opening the hatch down here was somewhat controlled. There's only so much of an opening that it's going to let in. You're only letting it through the vent port. If you open this door wide open, you're going to allow a massive influx of air right away. That fire is going to aggressively reignite. So I don't know if we'll get that by doing this, but we're going to give it a shot. This is also why portage and main, most all outdoor boilers, unless there's probably the exception of some home built ones, they have some form of a safety catch. Whether there's, you got to move the handle up and over, like was with our Ridgewood stove. The central boiler, when you flip the lever up, that had a catch that you had to push it a little bit extra up so it would unhook. The portage and main has a system with these little hooks here. This is actually how the door latch works, but you've got to, when you open it, you pull the lever all the way over and it's still latched in here, so that if you get that backdraft effect, when that happens, that's going to be, they're also known as a smoke explosion. So it's actually, again, it's an aggressive forced fire, and it'll actually push out. It'll build up a huge amount of pressure and try to blow that door back out at you. These latches will stop that. So I'm going to pull this open here. Now what do you notice? You got smoke coming out here. You don't have really much coming out of here. This, and you can't see it on camera, you'll get the smoke come up a little bit, but then it's going to suck back in. So that's the fire trying to pull oxygen in. And the fire is actually dampened down enough that it's not going to do the backdraft phenomenon. But when you open that door up, so now we've got this open. So now the reason the smoke eventually comes out, and this is why if the fire does that backdraft, it comes out at you, because this opening is much bigger than the chimney. But as you can see in here, just by bringing up oxygen, fire's starting to reignite. Now I just loaded that. That's probably part of the reason that the fire didn't aggressively come out, because not all the fuel was heated up fully. It's not burned, and it was a short burn cycle. But if there was a lot of coals, a heavy amount of coals, a lot of heat there, it could potentially heat that up to where it would flash. So, but you can see the fire starting to pick back up from having that door open. But again, we close that door. Hook the latch. We close the door off. You look up, and smoke starts dying off again. So that's very basically how an outdoor boiler heats, how it controls a fire, and doesn't burn up all your wood, doesn't boil over the water. And this will do this all the time. It'll just cycle, burn, not burn, let it smolder. One of the side effects is the creosote buildup. So when you dampen the fire down, it's got all that carbon, all that fuel that's partially burned and actually been vaporized up in the air inside the boiler, which comes in contact with the colder metal from that's cooled by the water. I know it sounds funny, we're heating up the water, but the water actually cools that fire down, cools the air down. It's a colder surface, so that condenses, creates that creosote. So that's why no matter how efficient, no matter how elaborate your boiler is, and how clean it is when it burns, it's always going to make creosote. It's always going to do that because of the nature of how these work. So that's why it's important to have dry wood as well, because the drier your wood is, the less moisture in the air. You're only dealing with the moisture, hot moisture condenses, right? So it's kind of like right now, I'm out in the cold. When I walk back in, the house has some humidity in the house, and there's moisture in the air that's warm. It's going to find my glasses. That's what gets your glasses to fog up. Same principle here. So the less moisture you have in the air, the less creosote you're going to make. You're always going to make some. We don't burn wood that is zero moisture. If wood was zero moisture, it would be dust. Kind of like humans. If our moisture goes down to zero, eventually we turn to dust. Nothing to bond us anymore, nothing to keep our cells intact and bonded together. So, all right, guys. So I hope this helps you understand how a boiler works, how fire works, and gives you just some basic knowledge that'll help you. Having a basic understanding of these principles helps you to diagnose when you're having problems with your boiler. When you're having problems with it burning, whether it's a conventional boiler or it's a gas fire. A lot of people have problems with gas fires early on because they don't understand how they burn. Having this understanding hopefully will help you if you do have a boiler and you run into issues to understand how to potentially diagnose a problem. I mean, some problems with a boiler that can happen, a leak or something like that's obvious. That has nothing to do with the fire. That has more to do with the materials. But if you're having problems with your fire, it's not getting hot enough, it's not, doing what you expect, think about this fire triangle. If you're not getting fire, something here is missing. So figure out what that is, and you can diagnose it. You can diagnose at least a basic problem if it's not to do with the electronics or anything, of course. But all right, I filled you guys' head with enough knowledge, so I think I'm gonna call that a wrap. But if you like what you saw, please, and I hope you did, please like and subscribe. Feel free to share. But until next time, everyone, from all of us here at the beautiful Beavertown compound and Beavertown Outdoors, take care of each other, be good, stay safe, and I'm out.